Hello everybody, and good morning from Denver, Colorado, and happy local time across the world. Welcome back to our final week of the Global Classroom. It's hard to believe we're already here in December, and we'll soon be preparing for another new year. But we're very excited to have back with us a face that seems to be familiar to many of you. We just had some fun catching up and meeting our guest dog, who's back there in her background today. We're very happy and excited to have back with us Professor Lindi Von Mutius, who is the class of 1946 visiting distinguished professor of environmental studies at Williams College for the 2024-2025 academic year. Previously, she spent 3.5 years teaching and working at Harvard University as the inaugural director of the Salada Institute Climate Action Accelerator and the director of the Sustainability and Global Development Practice graduate programs at the Division of Continuing Education. She also worked with the Standing Committee on Climate Education to envision the future of climate education across Harvard schools. Prior to her roles in academia, she held senior leadership roles at the Trust for Public Land, the Sierra Club, and the Environmental Defense Fund. As a member of TPL's executive leadership team, Lindi served as a strategic advisor to the CEO, chair of the board of directors, and colleagues managing the Black History and Culture Sites Health and Equity programs. As chief of staff of the Sierra Club, she led a range of cross-departmental operations, including chapter-specific climate activism and environmental justice programs. She worked to solidify the Sierra Club's external partnerships with indigenous communities, conservative and faith-based organizations, and grassroots environmental justice organizations. At the Environmental Defense Fund, Lindi crafted the organization's global strategy to better leverage the organization's cap and trade and fisheries management work. She represented EDF in efforts to pass California's Global Warming Solutions Act and the Federal Toxic Substances Control Act. Prior to her work in the nonprofit sector, Lindi practiced environmental, corporate, and bankruptcy law, and she worked with the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action on expanding renewable energy tax credits for corporations. Her professional passions are environmental justice, toxics litigation, and increasing equitable access to the outdoors. Lindi has spent most of her career broadening environmentalism's tent to include voices from the grassroots, grass tops, academics, practitioners, and both sides of the political spectrum in service of climate action. After graduating from Phillips Exeter Academy, Lindi attended Williams College, where she is back now, earned her ALM in environmental management from the Harvard Extension School, and graduated from Vermont Law School. Lindi's research interests are climate change adaptation, environmental justice, and climate change intersections with bankruptcy, toxics, and property law. And she serves on the boards of the Summit Foundation, Defend Our Health, and the Trust for Public Land. With that, Lindi, we turn it over to you, and we really look forward to your presentation today.
Thanks, Mark. That was a very thorough introduction. So I will not belabor introducing myself, which is usually how I start, just to say sort of, why am I here to talk to you about climate justice and urban heat islands? And how that relates to the SDGs, but I'll share a little bit about me. So I actually began my very first environmental job of sorts was an internship with John Kerry's office. John Kerry at the time was one of Massachusetts' senators. And so he was my senator. And I got to spend time writing a bill that created the East Coast Greenway, which is a path that you can bike or walk, if you will, but I think it's more fun to bike, from Calais, Maine, all the way down to the Florida Keys. And in working on that, I really realized how you could connect environmental protection work with human development work and sort of creating spaces that people can enjoy. And then after I graduated from Williams, I went to work in Egypt for a couple of years, doing a very similar type of work with the slum dwellers in Cairo, which are known as the Zabbaleen, which is a sort of derogatory term called garbage people. And they are the ethnic minorities and often the lowest income communities on the outskirts of Cairo. And the way that they make their money is to, or generate some of their income, is to collect garbage from the city in donkey carts, bring it back into their communities, and then sort it and resell raw materials. And so the institution that I worked for had a partnership with the World Bank on a grant to really try and mechanize that process, take the garbage out of the community, and help the community also to create other sources of income that would help raise the quality of life in the community and address some of the biggest health impacts. So I think that was another formative experience where I really learned about how we can intersect environmental protection with human health and development. And that, I think, really formed the core of what I wanted to do for the rest of my career. So when I came back to the US and went to all the schools that Mark told you about, I graduated, I was a lawyer, and I thought, I'm graduating into the 2008 like recession where there were no jobs and there was really no environmental work happening, and it was bankruptcy all the time. So I was a bankruptcy lawyer. And what I learned there was that a lot of the toxic sites, the Superfund sites, the blighted industrial properties were an opportunity to fix things that had been wrong in cities for a long time. So I hung on to that, and it informed the rest of my career. And that background really kind of informs this lecture and why I'm so passionate about understanding how we can use climate adaptation as a tool to remedy these injustices and these problems that we've really focused in certain parts of the world and disproportionately impacting people of color and low-income people. I also was a reserve JAG attorney at the United States Air Force. And then, like Mark told you, I worked at a number of nonprofits, and then finally Harvard, and now I teach at Williams, and I'm really enjoying all of that. And so what I wanted to share with you today was a little bit of a case study on how climate justice and racial justice intersect, and where the movement is going towards making sure that the work we do to mitigate climate change is not going to exacerbate systemic racism and systemic injustice in the United States. So my lecture is going to focus a lot on the United States and US law. But for those of you who are living abroad outside of the United States, I do have a couple slides here about other countries and how the urban heat island impact shows up in other countries and in other cities. So at any point, if you have questions about the lecture, please raise your hand and feel free to interrupt me. I will certainly leave some time at the end for us to have a little bit of Q&A, but very happy to have your questions as we go along. So one of the things I want to share at the start of the lecture is this idea of sacrifice zones. And this idea first was sort of proposed back in the 1970s when Black communities were really starting to get active around preventing toxic landfills and other kinds of toxic industries from being sited in their communities. But it's a concept that you can extrapolate to all aspects of climate and environmental justice, to all problems in environmental pollution that impact people in low income and Black and brown communities in the United States. And the idea that a sacrifice zone is that there are people who are disposable, that society sees as less than, and that society then says, well, it is okay that the United States government has said it's okay to disproportionately burden those people with the negative impacts of pollution and other kinds of negative externalities, and let some other people have a much better quality of life. And I want to talk to you today about how that impacts not only life expectancy and human health, but how that impacts urban heat islands and why that's a really big problem given what we're seeing with accelerated climate change impacts. But I think that before we dive into that, I want to ground us in a definition. This is by no means the only definition of racism, but this is a definition that I think works really well in the context of us discussing the SDGs and sort of structures within environmental and climate justice. And it's a definition that ties racism to its systemic causes and effects. So I think that one of the things I want you to continue to keep in your mind as I talk with you today is that racism shows up in this urban heat island context in a number of ways. In purely obvious racial discrimination, in the history of how land was used and allocated in this country, in the history of how the economics were structured around those land uses, in the sort of consistent disinvestment in certain communities that leads to weak social capital, and in gaps in the laws and remedies that could potentially actually address the systemic racism. So this definition is from an author who wrote a book called So You Want to Talk About Race? And I can recommend that book to all of you if you haven't read it. It's really quite helpful in creating the language of how to discuss these issues in a meaningful and thoughtful way. And then, as you saw in the reading that I assigned to you all, redlining is where a lot of that systemic racism visibly and physically manifests itself. So redlining, for those of you who maybe didn't do all the reading, I'll just review really quickly, comes out of an action by the US federal government to essentially create a ranking system of how they would guarantee and back mortgages. And this was coming, out of a time in the United States where the economy was also in a very troubled moment. And also at a time where we were right in the sort of mid to end of the Great Migration, where you had not only a lot of immigration coming into the United States from Europe primarily, but you also had a lot of African Americans leaving the South to move to northern cities. And so the US government designed these categories to basically segregate and separate and deny mortgages to certain people based primarily on race. And what happens with that is that redlining impacts not only the individuals, right? The individual's ability to own a home, but it impacts the entire neighborhood because it starts to cause a pattern of disinvestment in certain neighborhoods. Because when you just have a bunch of renters, the city doesn't invest as much in the neighborhood services, in the tree canopy, in the quality of the parks. So you have a system that then creates additional inequalities that are often place-based. So depending on where you live, you have a higher risk of air pollution, of preterm birth, of cancer, of asthma, right? So there's all these things that come out of just the segregation of people under the redlining system. And those are visible today. And the articles that I had you read today really highlight some of those inequalities and how they are playing out in 2020 and beyond. But, I think one of the best parts of the Huang and Segal article is that they talk about the impact of redlining being part of this broader conversation that we are having as a country about the impact of racially discriminatory policies and really the acute climate risk for Black Americans. And you saw that as well in the Krieger et al. Article that I assigned, where she talked about sort of the impact of redlining and how that results in inequities and sort of preterm birth risk, especially among people who live in formerly red communities. And I wanted to just share with you a little bit more about the specifics of the redlining and how that was actually done by the government. Um, so if you look at a map of Philadelphia, you can see, the red zones, the yellow zones, blue and green, depending on where the most desirable neighborhoods were. But what I also want you to see is this description here, right? So this is the description that the federal government, that the HOLC actually put on this neighborhood track right here, where they said, many Negro families are doubled up. Section has been slowly deteriorating for years. Italians are slowly driving Negroes out. Small streets are principally two-story rows. So it's like the government, you can see in these records, and this is the University of Richmond's database. They have a wonderful database of all these descriptions that the government put on these different red and yellow tracts. You can really see that the government knew exactly what they were doing, right? They had a very clear sense that they were discriminating intentionally against Black Americans. You can also see that in Camden, New Jersey, which is where I did a lot of super fun toxics environmental justice litigation, a neighborhood that was extremely dumped on by heavy industry in Philadelphia and New Jersey. And so, due to the erection of the Delaware Bridge, entire district has rapidly declined, right? So they've built some infrastructure that comes in, and so now everybody moves out because nobody wants to live right by a busy, loud bridge. Except, 50% immigrant and 50% Black Americans, people who didn't have anywhere else to go, thanks in part to this system of redlining. And then you can see it in Boston, which is where I grew up, where again, you see that there's a lot of discrimination against Italian immigrants who are pretty new at this point in the country, and are being pushed into these neighborhoods that are in decline. And I wanted to also share with you some slides that one of my students made, who was working with me on a piece of research here. He looked at Portland and at the redlined neighborhoods in Portland. And if you look in a specific neighborhood of Albina, which is where the majority of Black Americans lived in that part of Portland, you can see that same language of the sort of like, well, we've got these poor quality neighborhood and it's a slum and it's detrimental influences. And, these are not people that deserve anything good. And so what the federal government did to their neighborhood was build a highway through the middle of it. And because that was a neighborhood that was allowed to be sacrificed, that was deemed a zone where people who live there can be sacrificed for the greater good, and their lives mattered very little. And if you look at what happened as a consequence of the highway being built right through the middle of the Albina neighborhood, the construction of the highway destroyed about 1,000 homes and a couple dozen businesses. Between the 1960 and 1970, so just one decade, Albina lost half of its residents. And if you look at media reports of the highway construction, there was just a lot of language in there. These are low-income people. These are uneducated people with little aspiration. Like there was just this very coded racist language that made it okay to sacrifice those people and build a highway right through the middle of their community without giving them anything in compensation for that. And so when I talk about sacrifice zones, this is the process that I'm talking about, right? It's the intentional decision to take a class of people and sacrifice them because what they are doing, what their quality of life is, doesn't matter. And so you see that in the article I had you read about Baltimore, where you can really overlay now the map of redlined neighborhoods with a map of life expectancy. And you can see that if you live in a redlined neighborhood, your life expectancy is a lot lower than if you live in a formerly blue or green zoned neighborhood. And this reality really underpins this idea that environmental justice is really social justice. And Clifford Villa, who is sort of the father of environmental justice law in the United States, He has this great section in his book that talks about, the reason disadvantaged communities do not separate the problems of environmental pollution from the problems of quality of life as a whole is that they're all interrelated, right? These causes are all interrelated because they're all caused by a pattern of systemic, consistent, centuries long racism that was supported by the US government's policies and laws. And so we have to start looking at these issues not just as sort of independent, discrete issues, but we have to look at them as structural and historical issues. And we have to, as the article I shared with you makes the point, right? We need to look at if we're going to take these problems seriously, we have to look at these interventions as a way of creating a structural change, not just going, okay, we're going to put an extra clinic there for kids who have asthma, and then that's all we're going to do, and then we've solved that problem and we're walking away. And so the reason that I think it's really important for you all in this course and in this global development practice program that you're all kind of involved in is that I think the biggest takeaway for me of the SDGs is always they're trying to accomplish the same goal, right? They're trying to say like, oh, these things are related and we can accomplish more than one SDG by focusing on certain aspects of structural problems. And here we have an opportunity to look at how to remedy structural racism by addressing environmental injustice. And I think that one of the greatest case studies for doing that is the urban heat island effect. So let's dive into that, and then we'll zoom back out and we'll talk about the laws and the policies and how we can start to work towards a more systemic and comprehensive way of solving some of these problems, especially when it comes to climate change and climate justice. So urban heat islands are essentially what happens when you turn trees and lawn, grass and vegetation into asphalt, right? So you create a bunch of densely packed surfaces that absorb and retain heat. And what you see is a real spike in the heat that you feel even at night after the sun sets. And it can be as much as 20 degrees in some places, the difference between an urban heat island and a more residential or vegetated part of a city. So I want to show you an example for Cleveland, Ohio. So this is the red line map of Cleveland, Ohio. And then if you overlay that with the map of the hottest parts of the city, what you will see is that they match pretty one-to-one the yellow and red neighborhoods here in Cleveland. So I think that probably comes as not much of a surprise to any of you if you did the reading on redlining, because you have a historic lack of investment in tree canopy, in park infrastructure, in green space in general. If you look at where the green space is in Cleveland, right, it's all in the nice neighborhoods. It's all in these blue and green neighborhoods. It's not in the red and the yellow neighborhoods. And Cleveland is one of the most segregated cities in the country. And Cleveland's most dangerous heat islands exist in formerly red line neighborhoods, which all happen to be predominantly African American and have been for about the last 100 years. So this is not just this is a problem of race as much as it is a problem of low income. And you see this in other cities. So you see this in Greenville, South Carolina. You see this in Baltimore, Maryland. You see this all over the country. If you start to study city maps of redlining and overlay GIS data on heat islands, you see almost a one-to-one match that the redline communities are the hottest and in dangerous ways. Here's another article that I didn't have you read, but I thought I would just share with you to sort of give you a little more of this context. And then one other thing that I think is worth mentioning, and it kind of ties the Highway I-5 Portland Highway example together with the urban heat island example, is what do you all see here? What do you all think is in this yellow circle? So this is a map of Providence, Rhode Island. You'll see here on the left, the developed land. So where it's the darkest red is where there's the most development density in asphalt. And where it is the brightest yellow on the other picture is where it's the brightness temperature, which means the reflective capacity and the heat absorbing capacity. So what do you think is this little thing in the middle? Somebody can just shout it out.
Is that the airport?
Yeah, exactly. That's the TF Green Airport in Providence, Rhode Island. So airports need a lot of asphalt, right? It's really impossible to land a plane in a bunch of trees and not die. So you need to create, asphalt heavy infrastructure. And so airports and highways are actually responsible for a lot of urban heat island effects. And we've known that actually since the early 2000s when a group of researchers studied different airports in Italy and their proximity to like centers of population and realized that there was a real correlation between proximity to an airport, temperature, and mortality, heat related mortality. And if you look at a city like Oakland, where you have an airport as well, kind of right there at the edge of the city, even though you have this giant body of water right here, right, where you think like, oh my gosh, it'll bring cooling air. And you have this huge set of parks in the San Leandro Hills over here, where you think, well, that's a lot of green space. Can't it just cool it down? Nope. The airport actually sweeps hot air into these neighborhoods in a way that makes the top heat islands in Oakland also be in the formerly redlined communities in Oakland. So because you're a redlined community, the government decides to sacrifice you and build a bunch of asphalt heavy infrastructure in your community. And so in addition to your community being low in terms of green space and tree canopy and other natural cooling mitigation techniques, you now are also you're sort of compounding the urban heat island effect because you have all this asphalt heavy infrastructure. And granted, I know it has to go somewhere, but historically in the United States, it's always gone right next to a black and brown redlined community. So it's a problem. And one of the things that I worked on at the Trust for Public Land was developing a solution for situations like this. So can't, really build a bunch of trees in an airport. But if you look at these two schoolyards in New York City, what you see, right, is this is a playground. This is a kid's playground. And this is a lower income New York City community. It was partly red and partly yellow. So this is a somewhat redlined neighborhood, but a little bit mixed. And when you have a 70-degree Fahrenheit day, so a nice, comfortable day where it's nice to be outside, the slide in this playground is actually 109 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you talk to the kids who go to that elementary school, they'll tell you that they don't use it because it burns their skin. Like they're like, we can't go there. It burns our skin. And so that's a problem. And it's a problem for a number of reasons. Because these kinds of schoolyards are actually what is called a mega heat island. They turn into these sweltering hot places, even on a normal 70-degree day, because the asphalt is absorbing so much heat and radiating it right at the ground level. So they're uncomfortable for kids to play at. And at the Trust for Public Land, we did a bunch of research that showed that almost half of American school children play on this, right? They play on a parking lot. They play on a piece of asphalt that is sometimes 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more on a normal 70-degree day. So what you see when you go to this school is that they're not playing. The kids are just standing kind of here at the edge of the building under the little piece of shade that they can get. And they're not really out playing. And of those, roughly half of the American children, 1.1 million have a playground that is actually considered an extreme heat island, where the temperatures are 10 degrees more than the surrounding areas, and sometimes 20 degrees hotter than the surrounding areas. And children are extremely vulnerable to excessive heat. There have been now starting to be some really good studies by public health schools to look at how children who are exposed to temperatures over 80 degrees Fahrenheit just can't learn as effectively. And they can't they just can't process information. Simple motor tasks decline in kids as low as 83 degrees Fahrenheit. So once it hits 83 degrees Fahrenheit, kids struggle to walk with the same speed, pick up objects without dropping them. Basic motor functions start to decline. And when you looked at Baltimore schools in particular, you notice that because of schools closing due to extreme heat, Black and Hispanic students actually were losing school days because the school was too hot for them to go and learn. And over the life of a child, children exposed to extreme heat have lower standardized test scores. And they actually don't go out and play as much. And that leads to anxiety and other socio-emotional troubles than children who get to actually play in a cool and temperate schoolyard. There's a Guardian article that has a comic strip that was done by a bunch of high school kids in Baltimore that I hyperlinked here. So if you're interested in reading more of the student stories about the heat, the extreme heat, you can check that out. And this is something that is, hits all over the country, right? So even at a state level, even if you zoom out from redlining and you just look at a state level and you look at the state of Mississippi and you look at where the African American communities are, where the airport is, right? Woo, right there. And then where you have the most areas of extreme heat, you have this overlay of the most extreme heat waves being in Black communities, especially where there's a lot of asphalt infrastructure. So you can see kind of here the fringes and the edges. And one of the things that the EPA did at the start of the Biden administration was now really seriously look at this correlation between race and extreme heat and mortality and test where the federal government would need to actually make some investments in mitigating extreme heat. And it should be no surprise to any of you that the places and the people most affected by extreme heat are Black communities. So by an overwhelming majority, Black communities suffer the most in a 2-degree warming and 4-degree warming world. So the EPA has now understood, I think, that all of this building science and data collection around redlining and extreme heat should inform the way that they execute their policies as well. And like I said, this is not just a US problem. In other segregated cities, whether by race or by income, you see these really drastic distinctions between who is dying from heat and who is not. So there was a great study here in Jakarta that looked at age and also income. And if you are an older adult, low-income older adult in Jakarta, you are very likely to have heat-related mortality in the course of your life versus other kinds of mortality. The same with Bangalore, India. If you look at the sort of land use type versus the heat, the parts of the city that are more built up are much hotter. And the sort of bare dirt lot parts also much hotter than areas of the city where you have green space. This is a study from Chile, from Santiago de Chile, and they look here at the correlation between extreme heat, age, and income as well. And there's a real connection between low-income older adults and heat mortality versus affluent individuals and heat mortality. That narrows in the summer months, that distinction, because in the summer months everybody's hot, but in the winter months there's a real sharp distinction between low income and more affluent communities. And so that led the researchers to say, look, we really need to think about long-term systemic changes that address the root causes of social vulnerability and environmental injustice. That exacerbate these disproportionate impacts on heat waves and disadvantaged communities. And I want to pause here for a second because I think that we in the United States are now entering a time again where if we want to see these kinds of long-term systemic changes happen, we will have to fight for them harder than we've had to for the last 4 years. And that is partly because the Trump administration has made it very clear in its first iteration that it does not believe in climate science. But the Trump administration also defunded and minimized all of this research that was being done on the impacts of climate vulnerability and low income and race. And so if we're going to follow the science and not the politics, we are going to have to fight a little harder to make sure the science wins here and informs these kinds of long-term systemic changes. And that's where I sort of enter the fray, because as a lawyer who spends a lot of time thinking about how we write more just laws that actually lead to these kinds of systemic improvements, this science is extremely valuable in making the case for why we need to address these kinds of climate mitigation efforts in a holistic way, and not just in a sort of like, oh, we'll put a cooling station up there and then we'll be good kind of way, which is typically how cities actually address risk. Like they look at the one piece of the risk and then they fix that and then they move on to the next thing, right? Because they have limited budgets. And so if you're sitting here going, well, duh, redlining, like, come on, isn't this obvious? The sad thing is it's not. It's actually really important that we keep having all these studies being published about the impacts of redlining on extreme heat and vulnerability, because actually we still have a long way to go to inform how policies address this vulnerability in a systemic way. So this was a picture of a protest against Scott Pruitt when he was first announced as the EPA administrator in December 2017. So I'm guessing we'll be doing a lot more of this in the next coming months and years. But what I wanted to share with you was that there are sort of 5 elements of environmental justice that the lawyers who are trying to work towards more just laws are trying to push for. And those 5 elements are fair treatment. So everybody should be getting the same treatment. Nobody should be sacrificed for another, for the greater good. There's no more sacrificing people. Everybody deserves fair and equal treatment. Meaningful involvement, which means that the community is actually engaged in making decisions or consulted in decisions that impact them. Distributive justice, which means that when you are fixing systemic problems, you're actually fixing them across the board. Procedural justice, which is you're not one good example of a denial of procedural justice is when you put up signs about the nuclear waste facility you're hoping to put in that neighborhood in English all over the neighborhood, when you know that 96% of the neighborhood doesn't speak English because they are new immigrants. Actual case I worked on. So I don't want to belabor this very much, but you can see that in the 17 principles of environmental justice, these ideas come up again, right? These 5 principles come up over and over again. And so I want to share with you a bill that I worked to help pass in California with the Environmental Defense Fund to basically bake those principles in to legislation around how California addresses exposure to air pollution and other environmental justice issues. So this bill passed, hooray. And what I wanted to tell you, what I wanted to really highlight was that it really looks at a comprehensive way to increase funding into those neighborhoods. This is the team when we were working on the lobbying, and we were pretty psyched that it passed. And I'm really happy to see now that since a lot of this research on redlining and the impacts of environmental health disparities and redlining has come up, this research, these ideas around systemic change have been baked into a lot of the state level legislation that you see across the country now to deal with environmental justice, whether it's defining what environmental justice is by baking those 5 principles in, or specific permitting decisions that a state is making. You see states really trying to actually bake this idea of systemic change and like sort of remedying historical inequity into their laws. So this is very exciting, and this is the kind of thing I like to work on. And I leave these for you here, just so that you can see, like, there's good news on the horizon. There's also a lot of ways to fix the urban heat island issue. Here's some ways. But really, if you notice, what people are doing are adding some vegetation, right? You add parks, you add greenery, you paint buildings a lighter color, you remove some of the asphalt infrastructure, and you kind of get to cool down a city. And there was a great study in Bangalore that looked at how much does a park actually cool a city space. And it turns out that up to about 100 meters from the edge of the park, you still feel the cooling effect quite dramatically. So it's very exciting. That research was extrapolated upon in China by researchers in Fuzhou, which I'm sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, so somebody please correct me. But where researchers actually realize that there's a specific cooling distance between one park and another park, and that you can actually create a necklace of parks, a chain of parks, and thereby cool a very large area of the city pretty effectively. So what the Trust for Public Land has been doing is turning these asphalt schoolyards that are 100 degrees into green schoolyards where kids can actually play and have some fun. And it turns out we have seen that it cools the neighborhood by sometimes as much as 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So even this little green schoolyard has an impact on this lower income neighborhood in New York City. And now the Trust for Public Land has done 350 of these green schoolyards in New York City. So that's a really great step in the fight against urban heat island impacts. And I will also say that while it may seem small and insignificant, this green schoolyard has done a lot for the communities. We hear all these positive stories from the communities about how they felt excited to help design the schoolyard, be part of the solution, and now they have a space that they can use in the city that's a safe space to gather and play. So I want to leave you with something hopeful, which is this video, and then I will end and we can have a little bit of Q&A. Oh, sorry. I will try again. There we go.
Mark, unfortunately, the audio is not coming through.
Yeah, we aren't hearing the audio. I don't know how critical it is.
Okay, it is kind of critical.
Okay.
It's no fun. Let me see if I can do this instead. Right here. Let's see if that'll work instead. Tell me if you can hear it now. Should be like some music.
No music.
Yeah.
No, we can hear. I think you have to, there is a button that you can push that says share sound.
Let's try that. Sorry, I've never had any problem with this before. Let's see. Screen share. Advanced sharing. I don't know. Share sound. Is it on the bottom of the YouTube, or is it part of the Zoom controls?
When you start or push the share screen, there is a small square that says share sound. Okay,
let me try that. Share sound. There we go. Thank you so much. Sorry, I've done this before and it never really has given me this problem. I apologize for that. All right, I'll go back and then we can, there we go. Hopefully you guys can hear it now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
Ask yourself, why do so many schoolyards look more like parking lots than places to play? At the Trust for Public Land, we saw these barren asphalt schoolyards, uninviting to students and closed to the community, and we recognized an amazing opportunity to reinvent them as vibrant community parks.
They had an asphalt blacktop yard that was unusable.
It wasn't even. When it would rain, we would have kids jumping in water.
It was a parking lot before, and then this area was kind of just blah.
Nature is essential for healthy, happy communities. But today, 100 million people in this country, a third of us, don't have a park within a 10-minute walk of home. The Trust for Public Land's mission is to create parks and protect land for people, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. We focus our work to address each community's greatest needs around climate, equity, and health. When we first started redesigning schoolyards in New York City 20 years ago, the Big Apple had less green space per person than almost anywhere else in America.
It has changed our community. You see old people, young people, you see infants.
We live in a city, everything is close together, so when they have spaces to run around and let out that energy, it's beautiful.
We have musical performances, drumming, dancing, Zumba, art projects, a chance to spread out and be free and choose how they want to engage with the space.
And this playground is the perfect place for those sorts of events to happen. And just the fresh air and just having a place to relax and garner some sunlight as well, and really can make a difference in their lives.
Since 1997, we've transformed more than 200 schoolyards across New York City, putting a great new park within a 10-minute walk of more than 4 million New Yorkers. Now we're expanding this work, partnering with cities from Newark to Philadelphia, to Oakland, to New Orleans, to Connecticut, to Georgia, to Tacoma, Washington. We are leading the movement to ensure that every school in the country offers students and the whole neighborhood access to nature, space to play, and a place to connect with each other.
It'll be a common place that everybody can come and be together and play and enjoy and get to know each other.
Then it builds that intrinsic value of their own neighborhood. Where else do you have that you can go, that you can enjoy, that's your own?
And the potential is extraordinary.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to leave you with this idea that you should figure out a way to put a park in your neighborhood if there isn't one within 10 minutes walking distance of you. But I'm happy to take other questions about the legal aspects, about it all.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for the assistance. Whoever helped us troubleshoot.
Thank you.
So thank you. Our first question comes from Julie Wright. Julie, are you on the line?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. Are you, Julie, are you in person in the Lehigh classroom?
Yeah. Right here.
Hi. Awesome. Well, good morning. So this is an excellent question. And this is sort of the natural question that I think all of us who are working in the sort of urban redesign, climate resilient space are battling right now, because there isn't actually an answer to this question. So if I had 2 hours to give you a presentation, I would have done 10 more slides on all the research that is currently happening around ways to mitigate gentrification, because green gentrification is something that happened without anybody sort of putting it together. And then all of a sudden you saw this as a consequence of this good work in cities to try and create green space. All of a sudden you had people get pushed out. And it happened in a number of American cities, to the point where folks who wanted to work on this problem said, okay, we need to figure out why it's happening. And it turns out there's a number of different reasons. So some of the gentrification has been happening because of generally the lack of affordable housing in a city for young professionals. Sometimes it happens because there's tax incentives for it to actually happen. Sometimes it happens because of rent control and other rent policies in local ordinances. And often it happens because of poor zoning, thinking ahead in the zoning laws. So one of the most important studies on green gentrification illustrated that green gentrification happens the least if what you do is revitalize a small urban lot. So like a green schoolyard tends to not lead to green gentrification, but Chicago's 606 Greenway leads to massive green gentrification. And the guy who's done the best research on this, his name is Alessandro Rigolone. He's at the University of Nevada in Salt Lake. Utah and Salt Lake. I'm like, what state is that? Utah and Salt Lake City. So I encourage, if you're interested in this, like just type in Alessandro Rigolone into your, into the Lehigh University library system, and out will pop like 20 articles on this. But that's the distillation, is essentially that if you focus on small vacant lots or schoolyards or other parts of an urban community that are not so large that they end up impacting the sort of bigger picture quality of life, but they impact that like sort of microclimate urban heat island effect. That's the safest kind of thing to do if you don't want to gentrify the community. The other remedy is to work with the city to create some zoning and tax provisions and some provisions in the way that landlords can raise rental prices. And that works really, really well. So when the Trust for Public Land worked with the Pacoima neighborhood in Los Angeles, which is an ongoing project, and that's a neighborhood of immigrants and Black and brown people that is wedged between 2 airports and 3 highways. So it's like the best example of infrastructure leading to horrible urban heat islands. When we worked with the Pacoima neighborhood, it was a coalition of about 16 neighborhood organizations and the city of LA. And one of the first things that we did was get the city of LA to actually create a bunch of zoning provisions and rent control provisions that prevented green gentrification. So that neighborhood has been able to be revitalized without seeing the displacement of renters, because gentrification is about displacing renters, right? It's not homeowners, it's displacing renters, and by raising rent prices. So that was one way we were able to prevent it. And we have had similar success in some of the work that we've done in Cleveland and in Philadelphia with that kind of a zoning regulatory fix, but it's still really location specific. So if there's a big takeaway in terms of answering your question, it is to actually figure out how to work with the local planning board or planning commission and the cities to make sure that protections are in place before you start revitalizing the green space. Is that helpful and answers your question, or do you have any follow-up questions on that?
Yeah, no, that was really comprehensive. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, this is something that I'm putting Alessandro Rigolone's name in the chat. This is something that I'm obsessed with, because as a lawyer, our job is often to look at a project like this and go, okay, what could go wrong? Like, how can we actually create a legal structure that protects people better? So it's a fantastic question. And sadly, we haven't found that one silver bullet answer, but the answer is work with what you got locally and try and figure out how to protect the people that are there in the moment. So it's a great thing for you to be putting front of mind in this conversation.
Great, thank you. We have 3 questions from Brazil coming in, and they all kind of overlap, so maybe we can tackle them together. The first related to spaces where there's maybe no possibility to do anything, like highly densely settled areas like favelas in Brazil. Cities that grow without planning, people buy land, build, and expect public services to arrive. How should housing policies work? And then similarly, peripheral areas with little space for interventions. So maybe we can tackle all those together.
Yeah, so this is another excellent question. And I will confess to all of you that my experience in working on this in other countries is almost zero. So what you're going to get from me is not a well-researched and informed answer, but what I'm going to tell you is what I know from talking with folks, with practitioners who are trying to do this in places like Brazil and in places like Southeast Asia, especially. The example from Bangalore, those researchers, there are people who are trying to figure this out in these cities that developed without any real urban planning. And I think that the best answer I can give you, the things that I've seen work, is when you actually have whether it's sort of like a grant from a larger nonprofit or maybe even an infrastructure-based grant from something like the World Bank or a development bank, when you partner that with actually working with members of the community versus going just through the government and then having the local government decide who gets the funding, if it's a community focused engagement, that tends to work. But I think that Santiago de Chile is a really great example. And when you read that study, which it's in the slides if you want to take a look at that, what is really clear is that government intervention is needed at a level where you are actually securing basic property rights initially, and then you can do this climate mitigation work. But because we don't really have the time to do all that other stuff first, we kind of have to do it simultaneously. So again, the projects that I've seen be most successful in places like Bangalore and parts of actually Mexico City and other parts of Mexico are where a community actually is like organizing to get that green space or to create that series of green spaces for itself and getting that funding directly rather than it filtering through the government, because we see a lot of inequity in the way that the governments are allocating that funding. But I don't have a great answer. The only answer I have is we need urban planning. And if we don't have that, that's a big climate risk, whether it be from flooding or extreme weather events like hurricanes and monsoons. I mean, most of the deaths we've been seeing around the world from climate disasters are as a result of people living in structures and places where they actually can't survive an event like that. But I wish I had a better answer for you.
All right, thank you to our colleagues in Brazil for your questions. Blaise Richburg, are you on the line?
Yeah, hello.
All right, back to Lehigh.
Okay. I love this question. So I love this question because when we worked on the Pacoima project, the group we had to work really hard to convince that parks were okay were the LAPD. The LAPD was like, well, put a bunch of trees here, we're not going to be able to like fly the helicopter with a searchlight over the neighborhood and criminals will have places to hide. And we were like, are you for real? Because that raises a lot of other issues about inequitable policing based on race in this country. But the way that we convinced the LAPD that they could get on board with this project was that actually there are a number of studies out of the city of Philadelphia led by a team at the University of Pennsylvania that actually illustrate that even a small pocket park reduces the incidence of gun violence in the park, in the neighborhood by as much as 36%. So it turns out parks actually don't lead to increased crime. What leads to increased crime in sort of neighborhoods where you have a park that is, maybe not well maintained is the fact that nobody is paying attention to the park. So when you look at the city parks where there are, where gun violence happens within 100 feet of the park edge, that is because that correlates very tightly to a lack of funding and investment in maintaining the park. So when you actually engage a community and you actually get people excited about being in the park and having, proper play equipment, a basketball hoop that isn't broken, like when you have those spaces in a functioning way and continued investment by the city into maintenance of that space, there's actually a pretty significant reduction in crime in the neighborhood.
Great. Thank you. Lindy, I'm gonna let you choose. We have several questions here about the same level of voting, if any of them jump out at you.
Yeah, I mean, I think so I'll take the legal strategies question because that's where I feel like my research and expertise is the strongest. And it's a good question. And I think I'd like to actually address it in the context of like, let's face the reality we're about to see in, less than 50 days, which is that we will have a federal government that that we can't count on to pass any kind of sweeping federal legislation to address climate risk or redlining. And we will have that federal government likely for the next 4 years. Although I think the 2026 midterm elections could be interesting, depending on what happens in the first 2 years of the Trump administration. So we're just not going, the Justice 40 Biden executive order that has actually had a pretty significant impact in directing billions of dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act to formerly redlined communities. And if you go, let me see if I can just show you real quick here. Let's get out of this. I think I have the tab actually open here. So you can go and look at the environmental justice scorecard for different federal agencies and see how they've allocated those billions of dollars under Justice 40. But and sorry, Mark, you can put the Slido back up. But so you can go check it out yourself. But we know that we're going to see an immediate end to that on January 21st. So what to do, right? What to do is state and local action. And I am most hopeful about those environmental justice statutes that require a permitting process that looks at historic redlining and disinvestment in communities before, as part of making future permitting and resource allocation decisions. So if you look at New Jersey's environmental justice statute, right, it actually mandates that before a project is approved, whether it be a highway expansion or an exit ramp or a toxic facility or a landfill expansion, like any of those projects are now required to go through an analysis of like, what's the disparate impact on communities around this piece of infrastructure? Are those communities formerly redlined? If so, what are you going to do to mitigate the impact so that you're not adding additional negative impact into the quality of life of the people who live in those communities? So that kind of work at the state level is really important because it really starts to pause the continuing sacrifice of those communities. I don't think we're going to see anything at the federal level. I don't think we're going to see anything at the global level. I think, sadly, Alexia, without strong leadership by the United States on climate in the global arena, we're not going to see anything positive happening. I just don't think so. I think that the only reason we had a Paris Agreement in the first place was because we had strong leadership by the Obama administration. And I think we can expect that Trump will withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement again. We may even, now that there's Republican control of Congress, see a actual like Congress needed to approve Trump's withdrawal out of the Paris. So we never actually withdrew from the Paris Agreement. Now Congress could actually authorize that potentially. And so we're probably going to see the United States not be a global leader on climate at all, at least for the next 4 years. And I don't think that we are going to, I think we have to focus on what we can do at a state and local level. Yeah. How can the US government remedy redlining? Well, there's a number of academics who have theories about that. I personally think, like, roll your sleeves up and let's get to work, right? I think Justice 40 was a really important step in making sure that those communities got government funding priority ahead of wealthier communities in the last 4 years. And there's some, I mean, if you go on, that website that I was showing you, and I'm happy to hyperlink it here, and look at some of the stories of the funding that's been allocated over the last 4 years. I mean, it's pretty incredible. It's created dramatic change on tribal land and in formerly redlined neighborhoods. That's, I think, something we need to continue. And whether you call that reparations or not, I think what it is a redistribution of equity, of resources in a way that acknowledges that there were some people who never received those for the last 100 years.
Great. We have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay.
Feel free to take any that jump out at you.
Sure. I'm trying to sort of see over big projects. Yeah, I mean, Taryn, I think you have a great question here that I also, that folks at TPL, we wrestle with all the time. I think that part of what has shifted actually in a positive way as a result of a lot of this research on the intersection between redlining and climate vulnerability to heat. What's really been positive is that cities have realized that instead of building like the 606 or this big greenway project, they actually get more bang for their buck if they build these smaller green infrastructure projects, and they invest there. So New York City has made a dramatic shift after working more closely with the Trust for Public Land on these kinds of small green space projects. The city of Cambridge, so Harvard has been working with the city of Cambridge for a couple of years, and now the city of Boston through the Arnold Arboretum to figure out ways to add more tree cover in formerly redlined parts of Boston where you can. And there have been some really beautiful projects in the city of Boston now. And those are sort of baked in, the rules for how to do those projects are now baked into the city of Boston's climate action plan. They built recently a really interesting park along the shore in East Boston, which is going to be one of the first neighborhoods to get flooded and is primarily immigrant, Black and brown. They built this really wonderful set of concrete structures to keep the water from flooding, but then they created a big green field that can get flooded and become a wetland. They created a bunch of parks around that concrete so that people have spaces to gather and play. And they did that, right? They decided to do that instead of just building a levee, a big concrete levee, because of this research on how green space and mental health are correlated, how green space and revitalization economically and socially of a redline community are related. So this kind of research, it may seem obvious to all of us, like, yeah, put a park there, it's great. It's not obvious to city policymakers. And I think it's really still important to keep this research going because it actually leads to better decisions by cities to do these kinds of projects.
All right, and one
block by block. It's like this work is not going to be, I don't know that we'll ever see it be a sweeping magic wand piece of legislation. I think that this is work that happens on a city to city basis, neighborhood by neighborhood. And that's going to really require people who are excited to do that public engagement and work with local policymakers, which I hope some are inspired to do.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question and then we'll wrap up, not only for today, but for the semester. Rick in Beijing, would you like to add anything to your question written here?
Yeah. I mean, this is an amazing question because if I'd had 2 hours with you, I would have talked a little more about how do you do this kind of stakeholder engagement, right? How do you actually, so as a lawyer, when I was litigating environmental justice cases, I was acutely aware of the fact that I was coming in with a perspective and a goal that was maybe not the goal of the people in that community. And it becomes really humbling really quickly when you are super proud that you got this $2 million settlement from this nasty corporation for the community. And then they're like, yeah, but what does it do for us, right? So I think that the strategy that I would say you lead with is really thinking about how to bring in as many voices in the community into whatever problem you're trying to solve. Whether it is trying to figure out how to protect this majority white, low income community next door to Williamstown from the flooding that they will absolutely experience in the next 5 years because of climate disasters. And, you know, having to think about, well, 60% of the people in that community voted for Donald Trump. So how are we going to talk to them about climate? And how are we going to talk to them about, you know, community and equity? And how do we do that in a way that isn't alienating? Because actually, we just really need to fix this problem. I think it really requires humility and being able to walk away from your own perspective and center what people need in the work that you're trying to do. And that is way easier said than done. But I have found that the most successful projects are the ones where the stakeholder engagement is actually allowing people to speak for themselves and tell you what they need.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That's a wrap on today. We're so happy you were able to join us and to shed some light on this very complicated and important topic. So thank you for coming back and joining us again in the Global Classroom.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a great rest of your semester, folks.
Yeah, thank you. And speaking of which, this is, we're down to our final minutes here. So I just wanted to quickly take some time to thank some of our sponsors, some of our support team, without whom this would not be possible. So first off, I would like to thank Dr. Lucia Rodriguez from SDSN, who is director of the Global Masters of Development Practice Secretariat. Lucia is really driving force behind the Global Classroom and keeping all the MVP groups in the network active. So Lucia, thank you so much for everything you do, including helping us to get this off the ground every year. Lucia, would you like to say anything?
Just thank you, everybody, for participating, showing up every week. And really, really, I love the energy that you bring to this course. And we hope to see you next year. Thank you. And thank you, Mark, because without Mark facilitating and doing his magic, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Also, thank you to Paul Walsh, who's served not only as a guest lecturer, but also helps behind the scenes, including directing our SDG Academy from the SDSN. Paul, thank you so much. I see you're on the line. Would you like to make any closing remarks?
No, again, thank you very much, Mark and Lucia and Bill Hunter and Peggy. So it's a bit of a team that puts this together. And obviously great attendance by everyone. I might just note that I did, John Patisse, you keep on muting. Eventually we gave out to just the course on revitalizing multilateralism for a sustainable future. I have updated that using the actual outcome document. But just to say, we are doing the second half of that for the World Social Summit, which is next year. And in some ways, that's a focus on what's called global citizen education, because it's really about education across borders, to build trust in histories, understand cultures, to support multilateralism. So it's a little different, maybe even from education for sustainable development. But I'd be very happy if you follow that course on edX, and it will bring us up to next September when we'll have another installment of the Global Classroom in its, 11th, 12th year at this stage. Yeah.
Oh, it's more than that.
No, it's more than that. It's 2008.
16th year.
16 years. Okay, good going.
Great, thank you, Paul. And I put a link to that in the chat. I started taking it myself, keep myself up to speed. You'll recognize some familiar lectures in there from some of our guests, Professor Sachs, Jan Gustav, and others. But that's a wonderful way to keep up to date. And keep in mind that the Global Classroom website has archives from not only this year, but previous years. Those will remain available to you as well. And you may use those and visit those as however you see fit. And Lucia and Paul have already alluded to our support team, but I want to, last but certainly not least, save our thanks for Peggy Kane and her team at Lehigh, her support team, who helped with not only the website, but our recordings, our Zoom presentations, the back end of all of that. They do a lot of the work behind the scenes, and without them, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you, Peggy Kane, and your tech team. Similarly, thank you to Bill Hunter, instructor and lead of the Global Classroom course at Lehigh University, for keeping this going there at Lehigh, and to all your students for all their active participation. And along those lines, just a final thank you. This wouldn't happen if we didn't have a couple hundred logins every week or so. And so thank you to all of you who have participated, who have joined us week in, week out. Of course, to all of our speakers who aren't on the line, but to all of you who have really seen this throughout the semester. We very much appreciate it. We'll have a final feedback form if there's any suggestions you have for how we might update this course in the future. We'd be eager to hear your feedback. But thank you to everybody. This is a wrap now for the 2024 year. Hopefully we'll be back again next fall doing this again. Feel free to join us if you're so inclined. Feel free to share this with your friends, with your colleagues, and others. But for one last day, have a happy local time. Happy New Year coming up. That'll be the earliest I've ever made that salutation, but it's really been a pleasure. And maybe we can turn our cameras on one last time and just say a final goodbye. So signing off here. Everybody have a happy local time and have a wonderful upcoming New Year.